All right, so let's imagine this for a sec. You're a philosopher, right? Think about Western thought, like the very foundation of it. Now, picture that foundation being like subtly reshaped, profoundly, but in a way that's not immediately obvious, by ideas from a totally different intellectual tradition. It's wild to think about, but this isn't some made up scenario. This is actually what happened with Arabic and Islamic philosophy influencing the Latin West.
And what makes this so cool, especially for someone like you who gets the nuances of intellectual history, is that it wasn't some isolated straight line of progress. It was this crazy period of transmission and transformation. These ideas, they're like popping up in unexpected places, and their influence, well, it's still felt today.
Right. So that's what we're diving into, the impact of Arabic and Islamic philosophy on the medieval Latin world. We're going to meet the major players, the big thinkers, and see how their ideas like totally shifted the course of Western philosophy. And our roadmap for all this, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. They've got this awesome entry, Influence of Arabic and Islamic Philosophy on the Latin West, and it's going to be our main source. Think of it as like a super in-depth report that sums up tons of research on this topic. It covers how these ideas spread and how they influenced different areas of philosophy.
Yeah, and for you as a philosopher, get this. It wasn't just a simple handoff of ideas. There was a whole movement, a real engine driving this intellectual shift.
Exactly. And that engine, the Arabic Latin translation movement, it wasn't just one thing. It happened over centuries. Like back in the late 11th century in Italy, the focus was on translating stuff about medicine and natural philosophy. Constantine the African was a big name in that, though it's funny how he kind of tried to hide the fact that these works were originally Arabic.
Like he was trying to be sneaky with these groundbreaking ideas.
Uh-huh. Yeah, kind of. But then things really ramped up. Spain, especially Toledo, became this intellectual hotspot.
Toledo, the city of translation.
Totally. The 12th century was huge for translation activity, thanks to guys like Gerard of Cremona and Dominicus Gondisalvi. They were translating machines. There's even a thought that maybe Al-Farabi's Enumeration of the Sciences, get this, it was translated twice into Latin. Maybe that was like the inspiration, the blueprint for a more organized approach to this whole translation thing.
Like a blueprint for exchanging ideas.
Yeah.
That's a really cool image, especially for a philosopher who loves seeing how intellectual movement takes shape. And it wasn't just individuals working alone, right? There was some serious teamwork going on.
For sure. Like Gundesalvi, he teamed up with the Jewish scholar Evandoth to translate Avicenna's De Anima. Actually, Jewish scholars played a big role in deciding which texts to translate. It's fascinating. So many things came together to make this happen. Curious scholars, the demand for scientific texts from French schools, the tons of Arabic manuscripts that became available in those newly Christian cities, and even the Archbishop of Toledo was a supporter. He saw it as a way to boost Latin scientific knowledge in a region where Arabic was king.
Wow, so from those early days in Italy to the boom in Spain, these ideas were spreading. What happened next? Did the translation movement keep going strong?
Well, the next big phase, you gotta know this, shifted to Sicily and southern Italy. And we start seeing translators connected to the Hohenstaufen court and even the papacy. Guys like Michael Scott and William of Luna, they focused a lot on Averroes. But here's the thing. Latin translations of Averroes didn't become readily available in those growing universities until about 30 years after his death.
And that timing is like really interesting, especially with all the changes happening within the universities at the time.
Exactly. 1255 marked this date. The Parisian arts faculty made a big decision. All of Aristotle's known works required reading. Huge. And because of that, Averroes' commentaries on Aristotle, they became the standard text in universities. So Aristotle, as seen through Averroes' eyes, became the heart of Western education.
That's a crazy amount of influence. But this first wave of Arabic Latin translation, it didn't go on forever, right? It kind of died down.
Yeah, right around 1300, Arabic Latin translations almost completely stopped. It picked back up later, after 1480 during the Renaissance. But the Renaissance translations, they were different. Mostly Italian Jews working from Hebrew versions of Arabic texts, although there were exceptions. One guy, Andrea Alpago, he went to Damascus and translated Avicenna directly from Arabic. The whole scene changed, too. It moved to the buzzing Italian universities, especially Padua, with support from the educated Italian nobility. These Renaissance translations were important, especially for logic and zoology in the 1500s, but their impact wasn't as massive as the medieval ones. And by the late 16th century, interest in Arabic philosophy and those Arabic Hebrew Latin translations, they pretty much faded away.
Wow, what a ride. It's incredible how much was translated.
Seriously. Recent research counts 131 different texts. That's a ton of Arabic philosophical thought that poured into the Latin West. And the impact, it was like a shockwave. Almost every area of philosophy was transformed. Natural philosophy, psychology, metaphysics for sure, but logic and ethics too. It's a reminder that the intellectual landscape we have now was shaped by this amazing exchange of ideas.
Okay, so these ideas are flowing into the Latin West. What was one of the first big changes? How did Arabic thought affect how Western thinkers organize knowledge?
That's key. Arabic ways of dividing up the sciences really influenced the West, especially through Dominicus Gundesalvi's book, Division of Philosophy, De Divisione Philosophiae. His book leaned heavily on his own shortened translation of Al-Farabi's enumeration of the sciences, Ida al-Ulum. And get this, Gerard of Cremona also translated Al-Farabi's work, but it was actually Gundesalvi's version that became more popular. It was like Al-Farabi with a Latin twist.
So Gundesalvi made Al-Farabi's ideas more accessible to Latin readers. How did that play out in the real world?
His book became super important. In the 1200s, all these anonymous introductory texts for art students, they constantly mentioned Gundesalvi. Sometimes they even called him Alpharabius, a Latin version of Alfarabi's name. Even other translators, like Michael Scott, when they were dividing up philosophy, they used a lot of Gundesalvi's stuff, even if they arranged it differently.
So it wasn't just copying and pasting. They were taking these organizational ideas and making them their own. What were some of the key ideas behind this new way of organizing knowledge?
Gundesalvi took some key ideas from Avicenna about how to divide up the sciences. Like, the main way to tell sciences apart is by looking at what they study. Another idea. A science can't prove its own subject exists. That has to be established somewhere else. He also used two types of subordination between sciences. One where a science studies a specific pars, of another science's subject matter, and another where it studies the same subject but from a different angle, species.
That's way more organized than what they had before. How did Al-Farabi's specific ideas fit into Gundesalvi's work?
You can see Al-Farabi's influence when you look at the breakdown of different subjects in Gundesalvi's book. For example, Gundesalvi took Al-Farabi's division of grammar into 7 parts. He also used Al-Farabi's 8-part system for natural science, which mirrored Aristotle's works on nature. Even in math, he followed Al-Farabi by dividing it into 7 areas. And it wasn't just arithmetic and geometry. He included music, optics, astrology, the science of weights, and even the science of technical devices, or ingenia.
Optics and the science of weights. That's interesting. Were those areas not emphasized as much before?
They definitely got more attention with this new system. And with logic, Gundesalvi followed Al-Farabi by dividing it into 8 parts, which included Aristotle's rhetoric and poetics. Now, this is different. It's not what Aristotle himself did, and it wasn't common practice either. One scholar, Arnauld de Provence, even pointed this out around 1250. He was like, hey, neither Aristotle nor anyone else considers rhetoric and poetics part of logic.
So they were redefining what logic even was.
Exactly. Gundesalvi, following Al-Farabi, also had 5 types of syllogistic reasoning. And demonstrative reasoning was the best, the most certain. This idea that demonstration is the way to real, solid knowledge that came from Arabic philosophy, and Gundesalvi brought it to the Latin West. So Al-Farabi, through Gundesalvi, totally changed how the West organized the sciences. It was a system that went beyond Aristotle and included all these new scientific areas that the Latin West hadn't really encountered before.
Moving on to logic itself, you said earlier that the Arabic influence there wasn't as strong as in other areas. What do you think that was?
Well, if you look back, fewer works on Arabic logic were actually translated into Latin compared to, like, natural philosophy or metaphysics. But the logic texts that were translated, they still had a real impact. Some of the big ones were the Isagar section from Avicenna's massive book, The Healing, Al-Shifa, Al-Ghazali's Intentions of the Philosophers. The first part of that was basically all about Avicennian logic and, of course, Al-Farabi's enumeration of the sciences, which touched on logic even though it was mainly about organizing knowledge. Also, there's Hermann Alamanus's translation of Averroë's commentary on Aristotle's Poetics. That one's important because it was the only medieval source on Aristotelian poetics in the Latin West, and it even influenced Petrarch's view on Arabic poetry, which he wasn't a fan of.
So even though there weren't as many logic translations, the ones that did happen made a difference. Were there any Arabic logic ideas that really stuck and became part of Western thought, something that a philosopher today would find interesting?
Definitely. One of the biggest things was Avicenna's idea of the subject of logic itself. He had this distinction between first intentions and second intentions. He argued that logic is all about these second-order concepts. In his book, The Healing, he said logic focuses on the secondary intelligible concepts, the ones that depend on the primary intelligible concepts to help us arrive at the unknown from the known. The Arabic word menon, which can mean concept, meaning, or intelligible, was translated into Latin as intentio, and it took on a lot of meanings in Latin philosophy too.
Okay, for someone trying to understand this, what are these second intentions, and why were they so important for Avicenna's idea of logic?
So in Avicenna's view, second intentions, they're like the properties that concepts get when we use them to learn. Think about the roles concepts play in logic. Subject, predicate, premise, conclusion. These are like second-order things. By saying logic was about these second-order concepts, Avicenna was basically saying logic has its own subject matter. It's not just a tool for other parts of philosophy. It's its own thing. And for a philosopher, this makes logic kind of self-reflective. It's not just about the world out there, but how we think about the world.
That's clever. It gives logic its own space in the world of philosophy. Did this idea of first and second intentions catch on with Latin thinkers?
It did. Avicenna's definition of logic pops up early on in Dominicus Gundesalvi's Division of Philosophy, which we talked about before. A lot of big-name Latin writers liked Avicenna's idea about logic, people like Roger Bacon, Thomas Aquinas, and even later thinkers like Pseudo-Robert Kilwardby, Rodolphus Brito, Hervaeus Natalis, Peter Orioli, Duns Scotus, and even that important nominalist William of Ockham. For a philosopher looking at this period, that means Avicenna's framework was a big deal.
But with such a big abstract idea, there must have been some debate about what it all really meant. How did Latin philosophers try to figure out the difference between these first and second intentions?
You're right. Exactly what these intentions were and whether they existed outside of the mind, that became a huge topic of conversation. It got messy, blurring the lines between logic, epistemology, that's the study of knowledge, and even philosophy of mind. For example, Roger Bacon, he said intentions were intelligible species, like mental copies of things in the world. Hervaeus Natalis and Peter Orioli, they agreed that intentions weren't just things out in the world or just qualities of the mind. They said intentions had their own special way of being, called esse intentional, and this being came from the act of thinking. For a philosopher, this raises questions about how our minds represent reality.
So they were saying these intentions have their own kind of being. That's a bold claim. Did everyone agree?
Not really. Some thinkers, like William of Ockham, the nominalist, he didn't like this whole idea of making intentions into things. He said they were just natural signs in the mind. Second intentions, for him, were signs of other signs. Then you had the realist philosopher Walter Burley. He said what people called second intentions were actually part of reality outside the mind. This debate about logic as the study of second intentions, it went on for a long time, even into the 1500s, especially among Thomas and Scotus authors. They were trying to figure out what Aquinas and Scotus thought about all this. For a philosopher, this shows how different metaphysical ideas affect how we understand logic.
Wow, so logic got really deep. Let's shift gears to natural philosophy. You mentioned earlier that this area had some really strong and lasting Arabic influence. What were some of the biggest changes that Arabic thought brought to how the Latin West understood the natural world?
I think a philosopher who's into the history of science would find this really interesting. You're totally right. Natural philosophy was bombarded with Arabic Latin translations, and from early on, Latin thinkers were like super curious about these new ideas. Even those early translations of medical and astrological texts in the late 11th and early 12th centuries, they brought with them a whole bunch of philosophical concepts from the Greco-Arabic world. These ideas changed how 12th century Latin authors explained all sorts of natural stuff. They started using things like the four elements, earth, air, fire, water, and their four qualities, hot, cold, wet, dry. They also picked up on the Galenic theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, choler, melancholy. And there's the idea of the three: spiritus, natural, vital, animal, and how they connect to different organs. They also integrated ideas about how the soul's different functions are located in different parts of the brain, the whole idea of the sublunar and celestial realms, the Ptolemaic model of the planets moving in circles, and super fundamental Aristotelian stuff like matter and form, action and passion, and cause and effect. For a philosopher of science, this is like a whole new set of tools to understand the universe.
It's amazing. Thank you. So it wasn't just a few random ideas, but a whole new scientific framework, right?
Pretty much. Though some Latin writers stuck to the traditional Christian view of nature, but others, especially the school of Chartres, guys like William of Conches, Adelard of Bath, Herman of Carinthia, and Bernardus Silvestris, they dove headfirst into these new medical and astrological sources. And get this, they often combine these ideas with stuff from Plato's Timaeus. Talk about blending traditions. Sometimes they even presented these topics by contrasting the Church Fathers' views with the views of philosophers and scientists, the physicians. It's like they were trying to merge Latin and Arabic thought. For a philosopher, it's super interesting to see those early attempts at reconciling different sources of authority and knowledge.
So the influence wasn't just in the 12th century, right? It continued as those later translations of Avicenna and Averroes became available.
Absolutely. Those guys had a huge impact on psychology, which we'll talk about more later, but they also influenced other areas of natural philosophy: physics, cosmology, meteorology, even zoology. Averroes' commentaries on Aristotle and his debates with Avicenna were key, like his explanation of how things move through the air, his idea that motion and time are different in reality, but only separated by what he called the numbering soul, and his theory that the stars being in place is just an accidental thing because their main deal is moving around the Earth. For a philosopher, this shows how seriously they engaged with Aristotle's physics. They were trying to refine and extend his explanations.
Those are some pretty technical points. This engagement with Arabic natural philosophy was on a whole other level.
For sure. And another interesting point of debate was the form of bodiliness, forma corporitatis. Avicenna thought it was this basic form of prime matter that had to exist before any individual physical forms could exist. But Averroes thought the forma corporitatis wasn't a substantial form at all, just an accident, like having three dimensions. Thomas Aquinas didn't agree with Avicenna's idea of a substantial form coming before the soul, but others, like Henry of Ghent and Duns Scotus, liked Avicenna's concept, and it even became part of the debate about multiple substantial forms, which was a big difference between Franciscan and Dominican thinkers. And people kept talking about the forma corporitatis well into the 1500s. For a philosopher, this shows how metaphysics and natural philosophy were intertwined in defining the very basic parts of reality.
So these debates weren't just happening in some abstract philosophical world. They had real consequences for different schools of thought and even religious discussions. One of the big topics you mentioned in natural philosophy was the eternity of the world. That seems like a sensitive subject, given the Christian doctrine of creation. It's a point where philosophy and religion clash, which is always interesting for a philosopher.
Yeah, it was a huge source of tension. The ancient Greeks, and then later Avicenna and Averroes, they all thought the world had always existed, which was a direct challenge to Christian belief. Avicenna connected the eternity of the world to God being the necessary being in itself, the eternal cause of everything. Averroes linked it to God as the prime mover, whose existence he thought you could prove through natural philosophy. In Giles of Rome's book, Errors of the Philosophers, the eternity of the world was like the biggest philosophical error of both Avicenna and Averroes. In fact, people saw Averroes as even more against the idea of a beginning of time than Aristotle was. This whole debate, along with some other philosophical ideas, was condemned as heretical by the Parisian bishop Etienne Tampier in 1270 and 1277. That shows just how seriously they took this conflict between philosophy and religion.
So the church stepped in because of this conflict.
Yeah.
How did the thinkers in medieval universities, the scholastics, deal with this? Did they just reject the Arabic view, or was it more nuanced?
While scholastic thinkers all agreed with the Christian doctrine of creation, but they really grappled with Avicenna and Averroes' arguments for the world's eternity. They didn't just ignore them. In fact, they used a lot of arguments from these Arabic thinkers, especially from Averroes' commentaries on Aristotle's De Caelo and physics and Avicenna's metaphysics. Even Philip the Chancellor, back in the 1220s, shows this influence. For example, Thomas of York, he used Averroes' breakdown of the four main philosophical views on the eternity of the world. They even used quotes from Arabic texts to both support and attack the idea of eternal world. Like they used Al-Ghazali's argument about how there couldn't be an infinite number of souls in an eternal world if souls are immortal. They also used Maimonides' guide for the perplexed, where he said both an eternal world and a created world were philosophically possible. For a philosopher, this shows how they used reason to tackle theological problems.
It's like they were trying to find a balance between philosophy and religion. How did Thomas Aquinas, a really important figure in philosophy, approach this?
Aquinas' commentary on the sentences is a great example of how they thought about this. He talks about Averroes' arguments for the world's eternity, like the idea that for any supposed beginning of time, there would have to be a moment before that. And the idea that only motion can cause something to go from not moving to moving, which means there had to be something already moving before. He also mentions Averroes' point that there would have to be a vacuum before a world that had a beginning. And then he looks at Avicenna's argument that God's will is unchanging and eternal, so God couldn't have existed before the world because that would mean there was time before anything existed. These arguments really influenced Aquinas. He actually concluded that, based on reason alone, the idea of an eternal world was more likely. But, he said, just like the act of creation itself, we can't fully prove or disprove the eternity of the world using reason alone. He believed that faith tells us the world wasn't eternal. And in his book, On the Eternity of the World, unlike many others, he argued that it was philosophically possible for God to create an eternal world, which is a very Avicennian idea. For a philosopher, Aquinas shows how to find harmony between reason and faith.
That's interesting. Even though he believed in creation, he was willing to consider the idea of an eternal universe. What about some of the other topics in natural philosophy that were influenced by Arabic thought? You mentioned the elements within a compound substance.
Right, how those basic elements exist within a compound, that was a big debate in the 1300s. And Avicenna and Averroes' views were central to that debate in the Latin West. They were asking, do the elements keep their own forms when they mix together to make something new? Avicenna said yes, they keep their forms. He thought only their qualities, like being hot or cold, change and blend together to make a new quality. This new quality then prepares the matter to receive a new form for the whole compound from what he called the active intellect, the giver of forms. But many scholastics didn't like that. They thought it meant multiple substances could exist in the same thing at the same time, which didn't make sense for a mixture. Then there's Averroes. He said no, the element's substantial forms actually get weaker when they become part of a compound. These weakened forms then contribute to the new form of the compound. But to avoid contradicting Aristotle, who said substantial forms can't change in strength, Averroes said these elemental forms weren't really substantial in the truest sense. For a philosopher of nature, this debate highlights the trouble with explaining how basic elements make up whole objects.
So Averroes was trying to find a middle ground when it came to elemental forms. What about Thomas Aquinas? Where did he stand on this?
Aquinas had his own idea, and it became super influential. He said the substantial forms of the individual elements are completely destroyed when they mix, and only their qualities remain. He agreed with Avicenna that a specific mix of qualities was needed for a new form to appear, but he said the original forms were gone. They were only virtually present, meaning their potential was still there and could maybe show up again under the right conditions. Aquinas had a lot of followers, but his idea also had a problem. If the original forms were gone, how could the new substance still be considered a mix of those elements? Avicenna's idea that the substantial forms stayed put, it didn't really catch on in the West. But Averroes' idea of weakened forms was more popular, though people understood it in different ways, especially the whole intention and remission thing, like how those forms could get stronger or weaker. Some, like Henry Bate and Dietrich of Freiberg's, the weakened forms became potential within the compound, and the compound's new form was something extra. But Averroes thought the combination of those weakened forms was the new compound form. This debate about elements and compounds continued all the way into the Renaissance. People who generally followed Averroes couldn't even agree on all the details. For a philosopher, it shows just how complex metaphysical explanations in natural philosophy can get.
It's a really deep dive into the building blocks of reality. And the last natural philosophy topic you mentioned was spontaneous generation. How did Arabic thought influence how the Latin West understood that?
Spontaneous generation, the idea that life can just pop up from non-living stuff, that was a big topic in medieval philosophy. Avicenna and Averroes had different explanations, and they both influenced the Latin West for a long time, even into the 1500s. Avicenna thought it happened because the basic elements mixed together in increasingly complex ways. When these mixtures got refined enough, he said, they could trigger new forms to emanate from the active intellect and boom, spontaneous generation. Averroes had a different idea. He said it was because of the stars and planets, how they're arranged. He thought those specific arrangements could activate potential forms in water or earth, which would then create living things. It's interesting, they even disagreed on whether humans could be spontaneously generated. Avicenna thought it was possible, but Averroes thought any spontaneously generated creature would be weird or monstrous. For a philosopher, these different explanations show how diverse ideas about cause and effect and the origin of life were back then.
So two very different ways of explaining spontaneous life. Which one was more popular in the Latin West?
For a while, it was Averroes' explanation. Like Thomas Aquinas, he said we don't need Avicenna's giver of forms to explain spontaneous generation. He thought the stars and planets were powerful enough on their own to create simple animals spontaneously. But Aquinas also thought more complex creatures, like horses or humans, needed semen and couldn't just appear out of nowhere. Aquinas' position, it's called the media, via like a middle ground. He didn't like Avicenna's theory, but he also thought spontaneous generation was a natural process controlled by the stars. And he changed Averroes' view by saying the stars weren't the only factor. But even though most people went with Averroes or Aquinas, a few followed Avicenna's idea that humans could be spontaneously generated. Albertus Magnus was one, and later on, during the Renaissance, Pomponazzi agreed and even brought back Albumazar's astrological theory about planetary conjunctions. Then there's John Buridan. He had a modified version of Avicenna's view, saying that all forms ultimately come from God, and spontaneous generation actually proved this because it showed that the stars weren't the only ones in control. What's interesting is he didn't agree with Avicenna about those specific elemental mixtures being the trigger. For a philosopher, this shows all the different ways they tried to explain nature using different metaphysical ideas.
They weren't just copying Arabic ideas, but debating, changing, and fitting them into their own way of thinking. Let's talk about psychology now. You said Arabic philosophy had a big impact on that too. How did Avicenna and Averroes influence how the Latin West thought about the soul and how it worked?
Arabic works on psychology had a huge and lasting effect, even into the 16th century. Avicenna and Averroes, they were the big names, and they brought this whole faculty psychology to the West. It was based on Aristotle, but it was way more detailed because of Greco-Arabic medicine. They knew a lot about how the brain, nerves, and spiritus worked. And from the 1220s onward, Avicenna's system, with its different faculties of the soul, the basic ones like growth and the senses, and the more complex ones like memory, imagination, and intellect, it became the standard in Latin psychology. From anonymous works like the Philosophy of the Simple to Vincent of Beauvai's Mirror of Nature in the 1200s, and all the way to the Philosophic Pearl in the 1490s, they all used Avicenna's system. Avicenna's arguments that the soul is separate from the body and his flying man thought experiment, those were really influential too. For a philosopher, this raises all those classic questions about the mind-body problem and what consciousness is.
So the West basically imported a whole new understanding of how humans worked. Did Avicenna and Averroes always agree on the psychology stuff, or were there disagreements that made their way into Latin thought?
They didn't always see eye to eye. They disagreed on some specifics, like which organ was responsible for touch, how smells travel, and whether humans had a separate faculty for estimation. These debates continued in the Latin West, but the most influential Arabic psychology ideas were Avicenna's theory of estimation, his theory about the different levels of intellect, and Averroes' super controversial idea that there's only one intellect for everyone.
Let's start with Avicenna's theory of estimation. What was that about, and why did it cause so much discussion in the Latin West?
Avicenna said both humans and animals have this internal sense called estimation, wam in Arabic, or estimatio in Latin. This faculty, it's like it perceives intentions, ma'anin in Arabic, also translated as intentions, in things, like whether something is dangerous or friendly, even if you can't see or hear that directly. His classic example was a sheep seeing a wolf and knowing to run away, even if it's never met that wolf before. This whole idea that there's a sense beyond the five basic ones that can grasp these non-sensory intentions, it became popular with scholastic writers. But there were some disagreements. First, Averroes and Thomas Aquinas said this estimation thing was only in animals, not humans. They thought humans had something else, the cogitative faculty, or batio particularis for Aquinas, that explained those instinctive reactions. Second, there was debate about whether you perceive these intentions directly in the object, like Avicenna and Aquinas thought, or if you kind of figure them out from what your senses tell you, like Albertus Magnus and John Buridan thought. And third, the whole idea of animals having judgment, which Avicenna's theory seemed to imply, that was questioned by nominalist thinkers like Adam Woodham. He said real judgment requires language, which animals don't have. For a philosopher, this whole thing brings up questions about perception, intentionality, and how animal and human minds are different.
It's fascinating how they debated about the inner workings of the mind. And then there's the intellects, which seems even more complex with its different levels, and the idea of an active intellect. How did Arabic philosophy and then the Latin West understand this part of human cognition?
Arabic intellect theory, from guys like Al-Farabi, Avicenna, and Averroes, usually involved different levels of intellect. It's like going from a potential intellect, just waiting to learn, to an active one that's always working. They took this idea from later Greek philosophers. The active intellect wasn't just part of the human soul, it was a separate thing outside of us. They all said this active intellect was the lowest of the cosmological intelligences. They were big on Neoplatonism, and they thought the human intellect could connect with this higher intellect. Most scholastic writers in the Latin West still thought both the potential and active intellect were part of the soul, like Aristotle said, but some went with this Arabic idea of a separate active intellect. Like Dominicus Gundesalvi and Petrus Hispanus, they totally believed in this external intellect. For a philosopher, this shows the different ways people have thought about the connection between the individual mind and a universal source of intellect.
And then there's the idea that separate active intellect being God himself. That would have some huge implications for philosophy and theology.
Right. Some scholastic authors, drawing on Avicenna and Augustine, they went there. They said the active intellect was God. Modern scholars call this Augustinism Avicennicent because it combines Augustine and Avicenna. Jean de La Rochelle was a big supporter of this. He said active intellect could refer to God, angels' intellects, or even the inner light in humans, depending on what you were trying to understand. This idea popped up in other works too, like the Summa Fratris Alexandri, but not everyone liked it. Adam of Buckfield, Bonaventure, and Thomas Aquinas, they all criticized this idea. We know now they were talking about Jean de La Rochelle and his followers. Aquinas especially disliked it because he saw it as illuminationism, the idea that knowledge comes from God directly, and that didn't fit with his idea that we get knowledge from our senses. Though it's important to note that Avicenna's own theory of knowledge combined both abstraction from the senses and emanation from a higher source. And his theory of abstraction was a big deal for Latin thinkers. For a philosopher, this debate is about the source of knowledge and how the human mind connects with the divine.
It's fascinating how they tried to figure out where knowledge comes from. Avicenna also had this detailed breakdown of the human intellect into different stages. Can you explain that and why it matters for understanding how medieval philosophers thought about intellectual development?
Avicenna had these 4 stages of the human intellect, but he said they weren't separate faculties, they were more like phases in how we learn. The first stage was the material intellect, which is like a blank slate ready for knowledge. Then there's the intellect in habitu, where you've grasped basic principles but aren't actively thinking about them. You have the potential to use them. The third stage is the intellect in effectu, where you've learned more complex stuff but aren't actively using it at that moment. And finally, the highest stage, the acquired intellect, al-aql al-mustafad in Arabic, intellectus adeptus in Latin. This happens when you connect with the separate, eternally active intellect. This whole theory about the development of the intellect had a huge impact on Latin thought, especially from Dominicus Gundesalvi to Albertus Magnus. They really liked Avicenna's idea that intellectual activity is a process, and it culminates in a kind of intellectual mastery that often comes through logical reasoning. For a philosopher, this model shows how they thought our intellectual abilities grow and change.
So how did this Avicennian model fit with the existing Aristotelian and Latin traditions? Did it just replace them, or was it more of a mix and match situation?
We see a great example of mixing ideas in an anonymous text from Paris around 1225 called De Anima et de Potentis Eis, on the soul and its powers. This guy took